The rain that Thursday afternoon wasn't unusual for Ridgefield in early spring. It fell in a steady curtain over the two-lane roads, slicking the blacktop and beating on windscreens as commuters made their slow way home. Erin Calloway had just picked up her youngest from preschool and dropped both kids at her sister's house before making a quick stop at Miller's Grocery. She had a school bake sale to prepare for in the morning and needed flour, sugar, and the chocolate chips her kids insisted on. At 34, she was the kind of mother who juggled schedules without missing details. Lists written on sticky notes, snacks in labeled bins, birthday cards mailed on time. The store's external CCTV would later show her pulling into the lot at exactly 3:12 p.m., parking in a row close to the entrance and the wipers swiping once more before she stepped out into the drizzle. At 3:14, the inside cameras picked her up, navy jacket zipped halfway. Hair damp at the ends, a faint smile crossing her face as she pushed a cart past the checkout lanes and into the produce section. She looked relaxed, unhurried. Investigators who would later study those first minutes agreed. There was nothing in her demeanor suggesting fear, distraction, or that she sensed anything out of place. She took her time selecting apples, checked the label on a bag of flour, and moved into aisle 7 for baking supplies. It was routine, so routine it would later seem almost scripted. 10 minutes after she walked in, Erin Calloway was gone. Not in the way people normally vanish, no dash for the exit, no obvious struggle. On the footage, she simply pushes her cart halfway down the baking aisle, turns her head slightly as if hearing something, and moves past the camera's field of view. She never reappears at any angle. There's no footage of her exiting through the front doors, slipping out a side entrance, or leaving through the stockroom. By 3:26 p.m., the cart is still there, resting against the shelf. When Erin's sister expected her at 4:15 and she hadn't arrived, she called her phone. It rang from somewhere Erin couldn't hear it, because it was still sitting in her purse on the passenger seat of her locked car. At 4:45, with no response to multiple calls, she rang Erin's husband, Mark. He drove straight to the store, scanning the parking lot with the rising panic of someone who already knows this isn't going to be a misunderstanding. He found her car immediately, wipers still up from the rain, driver's seat adjusted to her height, and purse and phone exactly where she'd left them. Inside, there were no signs of struggle, no clue to suggest why she wouldn't have come back for her children. The store manager, uneasy about a possible medical emergency, agreed to page Erin over the intercom. There was no answer. Employees began walking the aisles, calling her name, expecting to find her perhaps faint in a restroom or crouched in the pharmacy section with a dizzy spell. But after 10 minutes, it became clear she wasn't in the store, or if she was somewhere no one was looking. Police arrived just before 6. Standard procedure meant securing the building and checking all exits, including delivery bays, fire doors, and emergency stairwells. Each camera feed was replayed in real time from the moment she entered, then in reverse to double-check for missed frames. What baffled the responding officers was how complete the coverage was. Every entrance, every hallway, every door monitored. They could track other shoppers moving about the store without interruption, but Erin's image ended mid-aisle and was never seen again. Rain still drummed on the roof as they began their first sweep, the aisles now half-lit after closing hours. They checked storage rooms, stock areas, and even the roof access in case she had somehow wandered into an off-limit space. Nothing. The damp air outside smelt of wet asphalt, and the parking lot was quiet, except for the occasional car passing on the main road. Her vehicle remained where she had left it, keys, wallet, and groceries still in the cart, untouched. By 8 p.m., the possibility of voluntary disappearance was raised. It wasn't unheard of for stressed parents to walk away from their lives to seize an unplanned moment of escape. But those who knew Erin dismissed it immediately. She had left her children expecting her within the hour, and anyone who knew her said she wouldn't have risked their fear or worry for anything. She was deeply anchored to them in a way that made the idea almost insulting. Mark stayed through the night, pacing outside the taped-off entrance while officers continued to search. Employees stood in clusters, whispering about how someone could vanish without being seen. Some thought maybe she had slipped out behind a group, head down. Others swore they would have noticed if she'd walked past them. but the security footage would show no such moment. By midnight, the store was released back to its staff. Police took copies of all digital recordings, promising to review every frame. Mark drove home in silence, headlights cutting through mist, a grocery bag from the cart now riding in his passenger seat like some strange, unwanted evidence of the day. He told himself she'd walk through the door by morning, that there had to be an explanation that would make sense. But the truth was, something had already shifted, something irreversible, and whatever it was had begun here, between the shelves of a small-town grocery store. Rain still lingered in the air the morning after Aaron vanished, mist curling low over the rooftops as detectives returned to Miller's grocery with a warrant in hand. The store was shut down completely, lights dimmed, and employees gathered outside in coats, shifting uncomfortably as the police sealed every entrance with strips of yellow tape. Inside, a team of investigators began the painstaking process of pulling every hour of CCTV from every camera in the building, not just from the day before, but from the days leading up to it. What they found was unsettlingly consistent. Erin could be seen entering the store at 3:14 p.m., her cart rolling easily ahead of her, and yet she never once appeared leaving. Not through the main doors, not through the emergency exits, not in the employee-only zones. Every possible path out was covered, and every other customer could be traced from the moment they arrived to the moment they left. Except her. For investigators, the early hours after a disappearance are critical. And here, they were slipping by without a single workable lead. Uniformed officers spread out across the aisles, opening every storage closet, pulling back stacks of boxes in the stockroom, and shining flashlights into crawl spaces that had gone untouched for years. Two detectives climbed a narrow maintenance ladder to check the roof, but found only rain-slicked tar and puddles reflecting the gray morning sky. The store's delivery bay was empty, its garage-style doors closed and locked from the inside. The working theory, if there was one, was beginning to bend under the weight of its own impossibility. By noon, they brought in a canine unit, the German Shepherd strained against the leash, nose low to the floor, tracing Aaron's path down the baking aisle. It sniffed around the abandoned cart, circled twice, then continued toward the cleaning supplies section, aisle 11, before stopping abruptly near the midpoint. The handler encouraged the dog forward, but it whined softly and turned back, as if the trail had gone cold. That spot, a patch of polished linoleum between shelves stacked with bleach and paper towels, became the focal point of the investigation. Officers examined it under portable UV lights, searching for blood, fibers, anything. They found nothing. Outside, news of the disappearance was already spreading. Ridgefield was the kind of town where word traveled fast, and by the afternoon, social media had become a live wire of speculation. Some believed Erin had been abducted in broad daylight by someone who had been following her. Others floated darker theories, that she'd staged her own disappearance, that she had debts, secrets. And then there were the comments that the police hated to see but could never fully shut down, the talk of supernatural causes, of something unnatural about a person vanishing without being seen. Mark Calloway had hardly slept. By the second day, the lines under his eyes had deepened. His voice had taken on a raw edge, and yet he stood before local news cameras, pleading for his wife's safe return. He spoke directly into the lens, saying Erin's name again and again, reminding whoever might have her that she was a mother and that her children were waiting for her. Behind him, taped to a wall, was the last still image from the CCTV. Erin pushing her cart into the aisle, unaware it was the last moment she'd be seen. Detectives returned to the footage, watching frame by frame, slowing it until every movement was almost imperceptible. They watched the shoppers around her, noting their positions and tracking them through other angles. Nothing jumped out. No one seemed to be shadowing her. No one bumped her cart. No sudden exchange. She passed out of one camera's field of view and simply didn't reappear in the next. The logical conclusion was that there had to be a gap, a place the cameras didn't cover. But the store's security consultant swore the system had no blind spots, that every aisle was accounted for. On the third day, the tone of the investigation shifted. With no evidence of a stranger slipping her out unnoticed, detectives began to wonder if the answer lay closer to the store itself. An employee, perhaps, who knew the rhythms of the shifts and where the cameras overlapped, someone who could have lured her into a storage area and kept her out of sight. Quiet background checks began on the entire staff, from cashiers to night stalkers, while detectives worked on the theory that Erin might have been targeted in advance. Inside the police station, a whiteboard filled with columns of names, timestamps, and possible scenarios. Yet none of it solved the fundamental problem. How could a woman vanish in a space where every exit was monitored? That question was still unanswered when the store reopened under limited hours, a subtle reminder to the town that life was supposed to move forward. But for Mark, for Erin's family, and for the officers now drawn into a case with no clear beginning or end, the clock had started ticking the moment she disappeared, and every hour since had only deepened the mystery. Somewhere in those first 72 hours, something crucial had been missed, something that would take years to resurface. By the end of the first week, the investigation had stalled in every obvious direction, forcing detectives to start circling in on people who had been inside the store when Erin vanished. That's when the name Glenn Harlow began showing up more often in their notes. Glenn was 38, a night stalker who'd worked at Miller's Grocery for just under a year. He kept to himself, lived alone in a small rented trailer on the edge of town, and had a minor criminal record, petty theft and a DUI from years back. On paper, he didn't stand out much, but one detail caught the lead detective's attention. The time logs from that day showed Glenn away from his assigned stalking area for 12 full minutes, almost perfectly overlapping with the window when Erin disappeared from the cameras. When two detectives showed up at his trailer, Glenn didn't seem surprised. He was cooperative, letting them search the place without hesitation. They found nothing connected to Erin, no women's belongings, no suspicious cleaning products, nothing that could tie him to her. But when pressed about his missing 12 minutes, Glenn claimed he'd been in the employee restroom. He even offered to show them exactly where it was and how it was possible to walk there and back without ever passing through an area visible to customers. The explanation seemed plausible, but with no one able to confirm his whereabouts, it remained only his word. Detectives decided to administer a polygraph. Glenn agreed. Sitting through hours of questioning while sensors monitored every twitch of his breathing and pulse. The results came back in that frustrating middle ground, neither clearly deceptive nor definitively clean. The machine registered spikes when he was asked whether he had seen Erin after she entered the store and whether he had anything to do with her disappearance, but the polygraph examiner couldn't determine if the spikes were caused by deception, anxiety, or simple anger at being suspected. The lack of solid evidence might have been the end of it, if not for a strange discovery buried in the building's history. The current store manager assured detectives that the store had no basement, no underground space where someone could hide. But when one investigator dug into old property records, he uncovered blueprints from the 1980s, back when the building was part of a regional distribution hub. The drawings showed a vertical delivery chute running down beneath what was now Aisle 9, used decades ago for moving shipments between floors before the basement was sealed off during renovations. That detail was impossible to ignore. The spot lined up almost exactly with the section where Erin's scent trail had gone cold. For days, crews worked to locate any surviving access point. When they finally broke through a panel in a rear storage area, they found the chute, narrow, rusted, and long abandoned. It dropped into a dusty, airless chamber no bigger than a walk-in closet. Rat droppings coated the floor, and cobwebs hung thick from the ceiling. A flashlight scan revealed no signs of recent use, no footprints, no clothing fibers, nothing that suggested a person had been down there in years. The crime lab swept the space, confirming what it looked like. There was nothing to connect it to Erin's disappearance. Still, the find kept suspicion pointed toward someone who might have known the building's oldest secrets. Glenn had worked in the stockroom, had keys to storage areas, and could have passed through the back corridors without anyone noticing. Even without evidence, the public's imagination began to lock onto him. Rumors started in break rooms and spilled into the community. Whispers that Glenn was weird, that he'd been fired from other jobs, and that he'd been seen staring too long at female shoppers. None of it could be proven, but in a small town, whispers were almost as damaging as facts. By the third week, Glenn could feel the weight of the stairs when he walked into a store or filled his tank at the gas station. Neighbors who once waved now kept their distance. Parents told their kids not to go near him. He started missing shifts, citing illness, though he knew no one believed him. When his manager called him into the office, the conversation was short and without comfort. Maybe it would be best if he stepped away until things cooled down. 2 days later, Glenn quit outright. He packed his belongings into the back of his pickup and left Ridgefield under a moonless sky, saying nothing to anyone. Officially, he was never named a suspect, only a person of interest in a case that still had no clear direction. But for many in town, his departure seemed like a silent admission of guilt. For detectives, though, it was another lead that ended exactly where so many others in Aaron's case had ended, in an empty room with no proof, no confession, and no sign of the woman they were still trying to find. It should have been the moment when suspicion collapsed under its own lack of evidence. Instead, it marked the beginning of a quieter, more dangerous phase of the investigation, one where the facts grew colder, the official statements fewer, and the possibility that someone inside the store had known exactly how to make a person disappear became harder to ignore. By the time the leaves turned that first autumn, the bright urgency that had filled the first weeks of Aaron's disappearance had begun to dull into something quieter, heavier. Flyers with her face still clung to telephone poles and gas station windows, but the paper was curling now, the ink running from rain. Her children stopped asking when she was coming home, not because they understood, but because the adults around them no longer had an answer they could give without their voices breaking. Mark Calloway kept the house running as best he could, packing lunches, helping with homework, making dinner, but there was a hollowness to it, a rhythm stripped of its center. He worked his delivery job during the day and came home to a house that never felt warm enough, as if Aaron had taken the heat with her when she left. The questions never fully stopped. They just changed in tone. At first, neighbors had offered casseroles and rides for the kids, but by winter, there were more sideways glances than offers of help. People began to notice how Mark didn't cry in interviews, how his voice stayed even when he spoke about her. Some called it strength, others whispered that it was indifference. And in small towns, whispers have a way of becoming truth. Mark learned to live with the sideways stares at the grocery store and the way conversations went quiet when he walked into the post office. Aaron's sister Laura wasn't immune to doubt. In the first months, she and Mark had stood shoulder to shoulder, holding press conferences, sitting across from detectives in long, airless meetings. But somewhere in the second year, her faith in him began to slip. She noticed the way he avoided eye contact when certain questions came up, how he never volunteered new theories, and how he seemed to resent the search parties she tried to organize. To her, it felt like the behavior of a man who knew the truth and didn't want it uncovered. She didn't say it outright at first, but her distance from him grew in ways that didn't need words. Detectives, aware of the rift, put Mark through a battery of scrutiny. They pulled his phone records, bank statements, and work logs from the day Aaron vanished. The GPS from his delivery truck showed him completing his route without deviation, the onboard dash camera catching him at each stop. Witnesses along his route confirmed his presence. There were no unexplained gaps, no private calls that might suggest he was involved. By every measurable standard, Mark was clean. But in cases like this, innocence on paper doesn't erase suspicion in the court of public opinion. By the third year, the case had bled out into the cold file storage of the county sheriff's department. Active leads had dried up, tips had stopped coming in. The original detectives had either retired or been reassigned, and Aaron's name was spoken less and less outside of her family's small circle. The community's energy shifted back to everyday concerns. A new strip mall was built across town, the grocery store got a fresh coat of paint and a new manager, and for most people, Aaron's disappearance became just another unsolved story, something unsettling they remembered in flashes when they passed the place where it happened. The only real attempt to resurrect the investigation came when a fresh-faced digital forensics team, working through old evidence for training, examined the original CCTV hard drive from Miller's Grocery. The hope was that with better software, something might surface that the original investigators missed. The footage played exactly as it had before. Aaron entering at 3:14 p.m., pushing her cart, moving in and out of frame, then vanishing between the cameras. No frames missing, no signs of tampering. But one of the techs, a quiet man with a habit of staring at details others overlooked, noticed something odd. In one section of the footage, the timestamp seemed to jump backward by 2 seconds, then forward again. It happened only once, and so quickly that it was almost imperceptible. The team logged it as a timestamp loop, likely the result of a corrupted frame or a recording glitch. Nothing in the visual content appeared different. Aaron's movements didn't skip or distort, and the frame count stayed consistent. It was the kind of digital hiccup that could be caused by a momentary power fluctuation or a hard drive sector starting to fail. The tech mentioned it in passing to the supervising officer, who made a note but ultimately dismissed it as irrelevant. The case wasn't reopened, and the drive was returned to evidence storage, sealed in its box with the rest of Aaron's file. Mark rarely spoke to reporters after that. When he did, his answers were clipped, almost rehearsed, as if he'd run out of new ways to say the same thing. Laura continued to push for attention on the case, but her voice carried less weight without fresh developments. The family still gathered for Aaron's birthday each year, lighting a candle at the dinner table and leaving an empty chair. But privately, each of them had begun to reckon with the same unspoken truth. Whatever had happened in that store, they might never know. And yet, somewhere inside that sealed hard drive, in those 2 seconds of looping time, there was something, a tiny imperfection, that would not fade away. It would sit there, waiting for years, until the moment it decided to move again. By the time 2023 rolled around, Aaron Calloway's name lived mostly in the hushed corners of Ridgefield conversations. It was the kind of story that lingered in the air at backyard barbecues and in the checkout lines of neighboring towns, half-remembered, traded in fragments, reshaped by each telling. People spoke of her with the strange familiarity reserved for tragedies they never personally touched, but had somehow absorbed into the town's collective memory. She had become, for all intents and purposes, a ghost, a warning whispered to children about strangers, an unsolved riddle for amateur sleuths online. 8 years had dulled the sharp edges of fear, but the unease was still there, just quieter. The grocery store where it happened no longer looked the same. After a corporate buyout, Miller's Grocery had become a branch of a regional chain. The walls were repainted in bright, sterile tones, the aisles rearranged, and the staff entirely replaced. The original cameras, grainy and prone to flickering, were ripped out years earlier and replaced with a high-definition security system that fed directly to the cloud. Most shoppers now had no idea they were walking the same floors where someone had once vanished without a trace. To the employees, Aaron's name was nothing more than a rumor, one that seemed to make the night shift a little more uneasy. In the far corner of the back office, behind a leaning stack of outdated marketing materials and unopened seasonal decorations, sat the old DVR system. It was a thick, dust-caked machine, disconnected from the wall and ignored since the upgrade. No one had touched it in years. It had been left there simply because no one knew whether it should be thrown away, archived, or destroyed. Over time, it became just another forgotten piece of storage room clutter. One afternoon in late March, a new assistant manager named Chloe was clearing out the office to make room for incoming inventory. She was in her mid-20s, recently transferred from another branch, and had never even heard Aaron's name before. The DVR caught her eye, more out of curiosity than anything else. Wondering if it still worked, she carried it to the desk, wiped off the dust, and plugged it into the wall. The small green light flickered on. The monitor blinked awake with a dated menu screen, and for a moment, Chloe thought nothing would happen. It seemed frozen. But then, without her touching a single button, a video feed began to play. The timestamp in the corner read, March 12th, 2015. The image was grainy but clear enough to make out the familiar interior of the store, the shelves and signage frozen in time. And then she saw her, Aaron, walking down aisle 9. A cart ahead of her, head turned slightly as if she was looking at something on the shelf. Chloe assumed it was just an old recording left queued in the system, maybe one the previous owners had been reviewing years ago. But before she could lean closer, something happened. The footage, still running in real time, began to reverse, not jump back to a previous point like a typical rewind, not stutter like a glitch. It played backward, frame by frame, smoothly, as if someone had pressed a button, but there was no remote in sight, no input from her at all. Erin's cart rolled back toward the start of the aisle, her steps retraced, her head turned the opposite way, lips moving in reverse. The timestamp in the corner ticked backward with mechanical precision. Chloe froze, the small hairs on her arms rising as the scene continued to reverse without stopping. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the footage halted, frozen on a single frame of Erin looking almost directly at the camera. Chloe stepped back, uneasy now, and decided not to touch anything further. She called the store manager, who came in skeptical, assuming it was nothing more than a technical quirk of an outdated machine. But when he saw the footage, his expression shifted from annoyance to something closer to fear. He ordered Chloe to unplug the DVR and said they were going to call the police immediately. When the responding officers arrived, they treated the situation with the detached caution of people who had heard too many bizarre calls to judge one too quickly. But the moment the DVR was powered back on and the footage replayed exactly as Chloe described, their demeanor changed. The date stamp was unaltered, the playback log showed no manual input. The system appeared to have executed the reverse sequence entirely on its own. Within hours, the DVR was tagged as evidence and transported to the digital forensics lab. For the first time in nearly a decade, Erin's case file was reopened. And for the first time since that day in 2015, the investigation no longer felt like it was crawling forward in darkness. It felt like something, somewhere, had just moved. The DVR was taken into custody the same night it was discovered, sealed in an evidence bag and logged under Erin Calloway's case number for the first time in almost 8 years. It was transferred not to the original department that had handled her disappearance, but to a newer, specialized division focused on digital forensics and cold case analysis. The investigators who opened the file now were younger and more accustomed to working with encrypted drives and outdated security systems. To them, the mystery wasn't just about a missing person, it was about a piece of technology behaving in a way it wasn't supposed to. At the lab, a senior digital forensics specialist named Daniel Shu was assigned to the device. His job was to determine whether the rewind sequence had been caused by a fault in the hardware, a corrupted file, or deliberate tampering. He began by creating a full forensic image of the DVR's hard drive, ensuring the original remained untouched. Hours into the process, he found something that made him stop. Buried deep within the DVR's operating files was a hidden command sequence, an encrypted script invisible to standard playback software, designed to trigger at a specific date and time. The timestamp for activation was set for March 23, 2023, just days before Chloe had plugged the unit back in. This wasn't a glitch, it was intentional. Someone had programmed the rewind to happen years in the future, and whoever had done it had to know the DVR might sit unused for that long. Daniel documented his findings, his report stating clearly that the playback was not random and could not have happened without human design. But the real shock came when he reviewed the footage frame by frame. The section of video showing Erin walking down aisle 9 had been reviewed countless times in 2015, but always in real time, looking for signs of someone following her or leading her away. In those early reviews, the moment before she vanished had seemed unremarkable. Her head turned slightly to the right, her cart rolling forward. But in this new playback, something subtle emerged. The very instant the footage began to reverse, Erin's gaze shifted toward the camera itself. It wasn't a glance in passing, her eyes locked directly into the lens for less than a second, her lips moving as if she were saying something. Daniel extracted that moment, isolating the handful of frames where her mouth formed the shape of a word. The resolution was poor, but the movement of her lips was distinct enough to warrant further analysis. The footage was sent to 3 independent lip-reading specialists, each working without knowledge of the other's conclusions. The results were unsettling in their disagreement. One expert was convinced Erin had said, "Help," the classic and desperate plea of someone in immediate danger. Another was equally certain she had mouthed the word 9, though he couldn't guess at its meaning. The third specialist admitted she couldn't be certain. It could be 9 or mine, or even the beginning of a longer word cut short by the rewind. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery. If she had been asking for help, Why look at the camera only at that moment? If she had said 9, was it a number, a clue, or something only meaningful to her? Detectives met with Daniel in a closed briefing, their questions coming rapid fire. Could the message have been recorded later and spliced in? He explained that while editing was possible, the encryption surrounding this playback sequence suggested it had been embedded at the time of the original recording. Whoever inserted the command likely had access to the DVR when it was still in service back in 2015. That narrowed the list to employees, contractors, or anyone with a legitimate reason to be near the system. The reopening of the case brought an energy that had been missing for years. Detectives began re-interviewing former staff from the store, many of whom had long since moved away. Some were surprised the case was still active. Others seemed reluctant to revisit those weeks. The name Aisle 9 came up more than once, not in connection with Aaron's final movements, but as a part of the store that had seen repeated maintenance issues over the years. Leaky ceiling tiles, flickering lights, occasional plumbing work. What no one could answer was why Aaron would have looked directly into the camera at that precise instant, or how she could have known, if she did, that the footage would one day be played in reverse. For the investigators now leading the case, the word she mouthed was less important than the fact she had mouthed anything at all. It meant awareness. It meant she had registered something in those seconds that no one else could see. Late that evening, Daniel watched the clip one more time. His screen split into two windows, one showing the original 2015 footage as it had been viewed then, and the other displaying the triggered rewind sequence from 2023. In the original, her head turned, her mouth barely moved, and the playback continued without interruption. In the new version, her gaze sharpened, her lips formed that fleeting word, and then the world seemed to slide backward, pulling her away from the present. It was as though the message had been invisible until the exact moment it was meant to be seen. Whatever had happened in Aisle 9 was no longer frozen in the past. It had been waiting. And now that it was moving again, the question was no longer just what happened to Aaron. It was who had made sure her final moment would one day speak for itself. When the word 9 surfaced as a possible clue from Aaron's final moments on camera, detectives turned their attention back to the store's physical layout. They pored over every set of old blueprints and renovation permits, comparing the original 1980s construction plans to the building as it existed today. The same location kept pulling them in, a section directly beneath Aisle 9. In the earliest drawings, it had been part of a maintenance route connecting the stockroom to utility access points, but somewhere along the way, it had been sealed off. In 2015, that area had been written off as inaccessible, dismissed after a quick check revealed nothing of interest. Now, with new technology and a renewed focus, it was no longer something they could afford to ignore. The store's new owners gave full access, and within days, ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in. The first sweeps were slow and methodical, each pass revealing faint shapes beneath the concrete. One shape in particular drew the technicians' attention, a narrow void running the length of a short hallway beneath the floor. It was too uniform to be a natural gap in the foundation. This was deliberate construction, hidden just below the surface where no customer would ever see. Drilling began in the early morning, before the store opened to the public. Workers cut through the concrete at the rear of Aisle 9, their tools echoing against the shelves. When the section finally broke free, it revealed a dark, stale space beneath, a crawl space barely high enough for a person to move through on hands and knees. The air was thick with dust, and the flashlight beams caught motes swirling in the stillness. Investigators entered slowly, marking each movement. The crawl space led to a narrow opening in the far wall, and beyond it lay the sealed-off maintenance corridor from the original plans. It ran for only about 20 feet before ending at a solid concrete wall, its surface rough and uneven, as if it had been poured in a hurry. The place felt untouched, abandoned long before Aaron had ever set foot in the store, or so it seemed, until one of the crime scene techs spotted something wedged into a gap between the base of the wall and the floor. It was small, almost hidden beneath a thin crust of hardened dust and debris. With gloved hands, she pulled it free. In the beam of her flashlight, it glinted faintly, a delicate silver charm bracelet, one identical to the one Erin had been wearing the day she disappeared. The charms were tarnished but intact, including the small heart with her initials engraved on it. The discovery sent a ripple of tension through the team. If the space had been sealed off long before, how could something of hers be in here? Forensic specialists collected samples from the surrounding dust and debris. Back at the lab, the results were clear. While most of the dust and particulate matter dated back decades, a disturbance in that immediate area was far newer, estimated to have occurred months after the original 2015 search of the store. It was a subtle shift in the layering of dust and fibers, but it was enough to suggest someone had been here after Erin vanished, perhaps to place or remove something. The implication was chilling. Whoever had accessed this space had done so knowing it was beyond the scope of the original search. They had counted on the assumption that the crawl space and corridor were forgotten relics of the building's past, and if they had been in here after the disappearance, it was just as likely they had used the space to hide something or someone at the time. Detectives tried to imagine the logistics. The entrance to the crawl space was hidden under flooring that had since been replaced. Accessing it would have required tools, time, and privacy. That narrowed the possibilities to someone with after-hours access, maintenance, management, or possibly an employee who understood the building's history well enough to know where to look. Still, the corridor's abrupt end left them frustrated. The concrete wall at the far side showed no obvious seams or access points, no doors, no panels. If something had once been on the other side, it was long gone or blocked off beyond recognition. They brought in a structural engineer to examine it, but his initial assessment offered no easy answer. It could be part of a later renovation, or it could be sealing off an older section entirely. Without breaking through, they couldn't be sure. For now, the bracelet was their only physical link to Erin since the day she vanished. It was sent for DNA analysis, and though it was expected to match, the chain of custody was carefully maintained, as though every detail might one day matter in court. But for the detectives, the significance was already clear. Erin had been here, or at least her belongings had. This crawl space, ignored for years, was no longer just a forgotten piece of architecture. It was now the closest thing they had to a crime scene. And as they stood in the stale air beneath aisle 9, the knowledge settled heavily on them. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this place hidden, and they had succeeded for nearly a decade. But the wall at the corridor's end now felt less like the end of a hallway and more like the start of an answer, one still sealed in concrete, waiting to be broken open. The discovery of the crawl space and Erin's bracelet had already shifted the investigation into dangerous, uncharted territory. But what came next would take it into something far darker. As the digital forensics team continued combing through the encrypted data from the DVR, they found something no one had been expecting: an entirely separate video file, hidden deeper than the programmed rewind sequence. It wasn't tied to the original March 12th footage. The timestamp placed it 2 days later, March 14th, 2015, 48 hours after Erin had last been seen alive. When the file opened, it was immediately clear that this wasn't standard store surveillance. The angle was all wrong, too low to have come from one of the mounted cameras. The view appeared to be from inside the shelving itself, tucked behind the stock, peering out through a gap between products. The field of view was tight and claustrophobic, capturing only the center strip of aisle 9. The graininess was the same as the other footage, but the framing was intimate in a way that felt deliberate. Someone had placed a camera there, intentionally hidden from sight. And then Erin appeared. She was wearing the exact same navy jacket, jeans, and dark shoes she had on the day she vanished, but she didn't look the same. Her hair, which had been dry and neatly brushed before, now hung in damp strands around her face. The skin beneath her eyes was swollen, the whites tinged with red, as if she'd been crying or hadn't slept. She moved quickly, not with the unhurried, casual pace from the original footage, but with short, tense steps, her eyes darting from one end of the aisle to the other. She leaned close to the shelf at one point, close enough that her lips were only inches from the hidden camera. They moved in a whisper, the soundless video offering no clue to the words. Her breath visibly quickened, her hands twisting together before she pulled back and glanced sharply over her shoulder. It was as if she knew she was being watched, but not from where. The moment was brief, only seconds, but before she stepped fully out of frame, something else entered the shot. The shadow came first, spilling across the lower half of the aisle like a dark wave. Then, just before the feed cut abruptly to black, the edge of a hand appeared. It was broad and pale, with a jagged, uneven patch of scar tissue stretched over the back. The burn scar was large enough to catch the light, its texture contrasting sharply with the smoothness of the surrounding skin. The video ended there. No sound, no follow-up frames, just a black screen, as if the camera had been ripped out or shut off. Forensics enhancement teams ran the clip through every available tool, stabilizing the image, sharpening contrast, and freezing it on the fraction of a second when the scar came into view. The detail was distinctive: uneven coloration, tissue damage that suggested an old healed burn covering the knuckle and metacarpal area. Whoever this belonged to had carried that injury for years. It wasn't something you could easily hide. Detectives gathered in the viewing room to watch the enhanced footage in silence. The implications were staggering. If the timestamp was accurate, this meant Erin had been inside the store, or at least staged inside a space designed to look like it, 2 full days after the initial search. And if that was the case, she hadn't simply vanished in a blink, she had been held. The low angle of the hidden camera suggested this wasn't part of any official surveillance system, meaning someone had planted it there for a reason. Whether that reason was to monitor her, intimidate her, or capture something on film was still unknown. The burn scar was the first truly unique physical identifier in the entire case. It was more than just another shadowy figure or half-formed theory. It was something tangible, traceable. Detectives began cross-referencing every past employee, contractor, and maintenance worker associated with the store from 2014 through 2015. Medical records were harder to obtain without cause, but workplace injury reports were public within certain databases, and that was where they would start. But before any of that legwork began, the footage was played again, over and over, each detective studying Erin's movements. They watched the way her head turned sharply toward the back of the aisle. They analyzed the slight tremor in her hands. They zoomed in on her mouth, sending stills to the same lip-reading specialists who had studied the rewind sequence. 2 thought she was repeating the same word from before. 9. The third wasn't sure, but said her expression in those moments didn't just show fear, it showed urgency. The unanswered question was whether Erin had been filmed in the main store at all. The shelves looked the same, the arrangement of products consistent, but the low angle and tight frame left no view of the ceiling or floor. It could have been the real aisle 9, or it could have been somewhere designed to mimic it. If that was true, then the person with the burn-scarred hand had gone to incredible lengths not just to hide her, but to create a controlled environment for whatever they were doing. And somewhere in the middle of that possibility was a single, terrifying fact. Erin had been alive when that camera rolled. Whether she had been trying to leave a clue, plead for help, or warn someone about 9, the recording proved she hadn't simply disappeared into thin air. She had been watched, moved, and ultimately silenced, while the world outside believed she was already gone. The burn-scarred hand became the focus of everything. Detectives fed the image through every available identification channel: state employment records, workers' compensation claims, injury logs from the grocery store's corporate files. The scar's size and placement were distinctive enough to narrow the field quickly. Within days, one name surfaced that fit almost too neatly: Calvin Dorsey. He had been a maintenance contractor in 2015, assigned to the store during night shifts to handle repairs and renovations. His personnel file noted an on-the-job accident from years earlier that left him with second-degree burns across the back of his right hand. The photographs taken for the injury report matched the DVR footage almost exactly. Calvin's employment record had ended abruptly just weeks after Erin disappeared. Officially, he'd been terminated for theft, tools, building materials, and a few high-value electronics from a different location. The incident had never connected him to Erin's case, partly because he was a contractor and not on the same roster as store employees, and partly because, at the time, there had been no evidence placing him in her path. But now, with the scar, the hidden camera, and the suspicious maintenance access to aisle 9, the picture looked different. A judge signed the search warrant within hours. The following morning, detectives arrived at Calvin's rural property, an aging single-story house set back from the road with a rusted chain-link fence and a detached shed in the backyard. He answered the door with the flat-eyed calm of someone who'd been expecting them. He didn't resist as they stepped inside, splitting into teams to sweep the house and outbuildings. In a drawer in his bedroom, they found a faded Miller's Grocery employee ID badge with his photograph, the laminate worn and curling at the edges. Alongside it was a ring of keys, some standard, some clearly marked for restricted areas, stockroom access, maintenance panels, utility closets. The keys were dated in a way that suggested they hadn't been used in years, but they were still functional. The real breakthrough came in the shed. The structure smelt of old wood and motor oil, but in the far corner, behind a stack of weathered crates, was a large plastic storage bin with a tight sealing lid. Inside were several sealed evidence bags, improvised, not official. Each contained a piece of women's clothing, folded neatly and compressed to remove air. Some garments were unremarkable, plain tops, a cardigan, a pair of shoes. But one set made the room go still. Dark blue jeans, a pale blouse with pearl buttons, both matched exactly what Erin had been wearing the day she vanished, down to the slight fraying on the hem and a missing button near the cuff. The clothing was rushed to the lab for DNA testing. The results came back quickly. The skin cells and hair fibers embedded in the fabric were an exact match to Erin Calloway. The blouse and jeans had been worn by her on the day she disappeared. That evidence alone was damning, but the context made it worse. These weren't items discarded randomly. They had been cleaned, sealed, and stored with deliberate care. Whether that was to preserve them as trophies, to hide them from discovery, or for some other reason was unclear, but the intention was undeniable. Calvin was taken into custody on suspicion of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, the detectives reading him his rights as he was led to the car. His expression barely changed. His gaze fixed somewhere far ahead, as though he wasn't really in the moment at all. At the station, under interrogation, he admitted to knowing Erin by sight and claimed he'd seen her shopping several times during his night maintenance shifts when he came in early. But when pressed about the day she vanished, he denied harming her. Then he said something that sent a jolt through the room. "She's not dead," he told them flatly. No inflection, no emotion, just the statement, repeated when they asked him to clarify. He refused to elaborate, offering no details on where she might be or what had happened after she was last seen on camera. Every follow-up question was met with the same stonewalling, his eyes flat and unreadable. Detectives knew people in his position often lied, some to mislead, others to taunt. But there was a conviction in the way he said it, an absence of hesitation that left even the most seasoned investigators unsettled. If he was telling the truth, then Erin had survived beyond that day in 2015. If he was lying, then it was a calculated cruelty meant to keep the case alive in the worst possible way. For now, the physical evidence was enough to hold him. The scar, the keys, the hidden clothing, each piece tightening the noose. But the nagging question wasn't just about his guilt anymore. It was about what he knew and whether the words, "she's not dead," were a bluff or a breadcrumb to something much more disturbing. The answer would come soon, but it would not be the one anyone was prepared for. The case against Calvin Dorsey had reached a point where denial was no longer a viable option. The scar, the hidden clothing, the keys, the history of working nights with access to every locked door, it all formed a chain that was tightening around him with each passing hour. Still, he sat through questioning with the same flat expression, offering nothing that could be called a confession. It wasn't until his public defender quietly pulled detectives aside to say Calvin was ready to tell them everything, that the tone in the room shifted. When the tape began rolling again, his voice was calm, almost detached, as he described how he had spent weeks before Erin's disappearance modifying a section of the store few people even remembered existed. Between two outdated industrial freezer units, long disconnected and covered by false walls, he'd constructed a narrow, hidden chamber. The only way in was through a panel concealed at the end of the maintenance corridor, the one accessible from the crawl space beneath aisle 9. The door was disguised behind shelving, impossible to notice without knowing exactly where to look. On March 12, 2015, he claimed he had encountered Erin in aisle 9 as she was shopping. He spoke to her briefly. He didn't say what was said, and in those minutes, he convinced her to follow him toward the back under some pretext. Once there, he guided her through the panel into the space, locking it behind her. He insisted he didn't intend to harm her, that he just wanted her to stay there for a while, though the reasoning was as vague as it was disturbing. Erin, according to his account, was alive in that hidden space for 3 days. He fed her through a small hatch at floor level, bottled water, snack bars, and a sandwich or two. She didn't scream, he said, but she did beg to be let out. On the 3rd day, when police searches grew more aggressive and the store was temporarily closed, Calvan claimed he panicked. He feared the space would be discovered and feared what would happen if she was found there. That night, he returned, and by the next morning, she was dead. Whether she had been suffocated, suffered a medical event, or taken her own life, he wouldn't say. He admitted that instead of alerting anyone, he moved her body into a second cavity on the far side of the freezer wall, one he had sealed with insulation and paneling, leaving no trace that anything lay behind it. He said it was the only place he knew no one would think to look, a place he could guarantee she would never be found. A forensic team was brought to the store within hours of the confession. With the current owner's permission, they dismantled the freezer units and tore away the surrounding structure. Behind the first false wall was the narrow chamber Calvan had described, its air stale and its walls marked with faint scuffs that could have been from shoes or hands. At the far end, behind a heavier panel, they found the second cavity. The insulation came away in thick, dusty clumps, revealing a dark void barely large enough to hold a person. Inside were skeletal remains, positioned awkwardly, surrounded by remnants of fabric that had once been clothing. Alongside the bones were personal effects, small items that had been listed in the original missing persons report. Erin's charm bracelet was there, the silver tarnished but recognizable by the engraved heart. There was also something no one had expected. A folded scrap of torn paper, the surface rough, the ink smudged. It took a moment to realize the words had been written in eyeliner. The single word, scrawled in uneven strokes, was 9. The paper was bagged carefully, the chain of custody documented down to the minute. The handwriting was compared to samples from Erin's home, and the match was confirmed. Whatever the exact meaning of the message, it was clear she had written it while she was still alive and had left it in the hope someone would one day find it. Back in the interview room, Calvan offered one final detail that froze the room. After being diagnosed with terminal cancer earlier that year, he said, he had decided it was time for Erin to be found. He admitted to remotely triggering the encrypted rewind sequence on the old DVR system, programming it to draw attention back to aisle 9 and to her last visible moments. I wanted someone to find her, he said simply, as if that could erase 8 years of silence. The remains were released to Erin's family after forensic confirmation. The funeral was small but public, attended by those who had searched for her, prayed for her, or simply carried her absence in the back of their minds for nearly a decade. For her children, now teenagers, it was the first time they could stand beside a grave instead of an empty chair at the dinner table. Ridgefield, after so many years of unanswered questions, finally had the truth. But the truth came at a cost, the knowledge that Erin had been so close, trapped behind walls just yards from where police had searched in those first desperate days. The town would move forward, as towns do, but the name Aisle 9 would never again be just a location in a grocery store. It would remain the place where a young mother's final plea had been hidden in concrete, waiting 8 long years for someone to hear it.